the meantime, while all this research is going on, Levengood gets healed. He had had a gallbladder problem from the time he was just a young thing. And every morning he'd get up and he'd be so ill. He'd have to hang on to something, sometimes for 5 minutes, until nausea and dizziness passed. So one of the women who did not want to really be featured in this at all was the healer, and she noticed him one day. She said, "You don't look very good. Why don't you come in and let me give you a treatment?" And he was like, "Oh, okay, one of those." And so he felt so terrible, though, that he went in and he had the treatment. And he said it consisted of him laying on the sofa, and she put one hand on his forehead and one hand on his belly and sat there for 20 minutes. He said, "I didn't notice anything, I didn't feel anything, I didn't hear anything, I didn't sense any change or any shift of any sort." Got up, went home. Next day he got up, went to work, no nausea, no dizziness, no nothing. And this was something he'd been having for like 40 years. And he, about mid-morning, he said, "Huh, well, I'll be darned. Well, it must be a coincidence." So the woman, Dory, we call her Dory, had said to him, "If you ever need another tune-up, just come back. I'll give you a tune-up." He needed 2 more tune-ups, never had the problem again. His response to that was, "Whoa, you know, what did she do? What was happening? What, you know, why aren't we studying this? Why aren't we looking at this? Why aren't we documenting results? Why?" And so that was a big thing. For him, an objective scientist to be healed by, you know, somebody who is considered on the far edge, that was really far out. The other thing that happened was the Chicago experiment. Ed Edwards is a character. Ed Edwards was, you can read about it in the book, but basically he was watching TV, and Lefty was on 20/20, and he was trying to give some information about crop circles and his research to that point. And Ed had had an experience when he was a little boy playing in the woods with these little funny-looking kids who had gray skin. And they had this funny-looking craft that they could fly. So he didn't see the craft all the time, but one day they had the craft there, and he went running to the craft. "I want to fly that thing, I want to fly that thing." And they freaked out. "Don't touch it, get away from there." And they said, "It is going to be a long time before you can fly that thing. And before you do, you have to go north, and you have to find a white-bearded scientist." So he's watching 20/20, and there's Levengood talking about crop circles, and he goes, "Oh, I wonder if that's the white-bearded scientist." So he gets on the phone and calls information and gets a hold of Glenna, who has seen a whole slew of what she calls kooks going through Lefty's lab. And she's like, "Okay, here's another one." So he came to the lab, and, you know, and he and Lefty started talking back and forth. And then one day, Ed had been, I think when he came to the lab, he was actually working in Detroit. He did construction. And this particular experiment, he was in Chicago. It was, I guess, a warm day. He called Lefty on the phone. He says, "You got that equipment running?" And Lefty goes, "No, but I suppose I can hook it up." He says, "Hook it up. I'm going to send you some energy." And Lefty's like, "Yeah, sure." So they said, "Okay." Lefty says, "All right, I'll just do it." So they synchronize their watches and they set a time, and sure enough, Lefty turns the equipment on at the, you know, at the appointed time, and the needle on the chart recorder just starts to dance. And he said his jaw hit the floor. He said he couldn't believe it. It was almost too much for him. And the result was that he called Ed on the phone, and he said, "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working." And Ed said, "Well, I'm sending you pulses of energy, about 3 per second or 4 per second." And Lefty was like, "Oh my God, they're coming in at 3 to 4 cycles per second. So for Lefty, that was the end of the old reductionist paradigm. He was not able to hang on to the limitations of that paradigm anymore. And this was one of the breakthrough moments. I just kind of threw this in here. Lefty had been doing research with seeds, and this was the gadget that when Ed first came to the laboratory, he was so frustrated because he couldn't figure out a way to get to track the signal coming off of Ed's hands, that he dumped the seeds off and stood this thing up on its side and said, "Here, Ed, put your hands on this." And when he did, the chart recorder just went crazy. And so all of the energy was coming from Ed. And so that's a pretty special little piece of equipment. And also made a few other miracles with seeds later. So about this time, Lefty coins the term CDP to refer to the unexplained energy he was measuring in a lab. And CDP stands for charge density pulses. And here's an example of what different kinds of traces. These are different, I believe these are the same person after being exposed to different things. Neon lights, or, not neon, what do you call these? Fluorescent lights, et cetera, et cetera. But what he discovered was that everything had its own CDP. He was in love with carrots. He said they were the best test subjects in the world, and they never lied. And he discovered that the cambium and the xylem and the proxylem and everything in the carrot had its own CDP. And he also discovered that the heart had its own CDP, and the liver and the kidneys, and every part of the body had its own CDP. So he was still trying to put all this together. After Ed was when he started looking for people like myself. And this was somebody else. This was Jaya. Jaya is a fabulous healer up in the Michigan area. She treated water, which we then used to soak seeds with. And what you see are the untreated water on the left and the treated water on the right. You get a tremendous increase in growth and the speed with which things develop. So, let's see. Oh, this was a thing that I did. We did a few remote sending things from my living room to his laboratory, 100 miles apart. And, it went from dead out to bouncing all over the place. And then, so after the thing with the water and discovering that you could treat water and the water would make the changes in the living system, whether it was seeds or people or whoever, Lefty started researching water, just pure research. He said it was much more complex than what most people thought, which I knew, but the common perception is water is just water. It's H2O. So he had a tank sitting on the bench, and he had it hooked up to his equipment, and he had that, he was checking the CDP of that water and just letting that thing run day after day after day. And about, I think 2 months into the experiment, he had, he was pretty used to what the sound of that needle tracing out that signal was. And he was up one morning. Lefty had a very unusual schedule. He would go to bed at 7 o'clock at night. He would get up at 2 a.m. He would work until maybe 6 or 7, and then he would go down and he would have his one meal of the day. And that one meal was the same meal for 50-some years. It was a little bit of salad and some noodles with some spaghetti sauce on it. No meat. He was vegetarian. I said to him, how can you live on that diet? He would make himself a big pot of spaghetti every 10 days and a big bowl of salad every 10 days, and he would eat that until it was gone, and then he'd make another. And he did that for 50 years. And when I was saying to him, how are you going to stay healthy? He said, I told Spirit, don't bother me about food. I'll do what I came here to do, but don't bother me about food. And so that was his attitude. And healthy as a horse. So, what does that say about all those fancy diets out there? There's a lot more I could say about that. So, yeah. Yeah, the intention of the individual is very, very important. So this particular morning, he had gotten up and he was working in the lab. It was, I don't know what time it was, but he noticed that the needle sounded differently. And so he went over and he's looking at this thing just doing something very unusual. Now water, as it turns out, is communicating with all water on the earth all the time. So he goes over to the bench and he says, okay, you know, something's going on here. This is not what water usually does. Water has a diurnal cycle. Every morning, when the sun comes over that horizon, instantly, the CDP of the water jumps. Big jump. And then it continues to rise all the way till noon, and then it goes down. And it drops until about 4:30 in the afternoon, and then it goes up a little bit till about 7:30, and then it stays kind of steady from the time the sun goes down until the next morning when the same cycle happens. That's its diurnal cycle. And so we had this diurnal cycle well established. We knew what it was like. Our theory was that when the sun comes around the horizon, it's pushing this huge wave of electrons and particles. And so those are something that we must be using, and everything is using. Water, everything. So he goes downstairs to have some breakfast. And he's like, what is wrong with my equipment? Why would the equipment be? He's thinking now it's a malfunction. And so he turns on the TV while he's eating his spaghetti. And there's all over the news is the story of the London bombings. And so he's remembering, which I mention in the book, a friend of his, this is a different scientist, who's now passed, had been measuring what we think are the CDP energies of the planet Earth, and at the time of the Columbine shooting, those energies went berserk. And so what Lefty was thinking was, I wonder if what's happening in the lab, that funny signal, is related to the collective consciousness and the horror of what's happening in London. Because the CDP went up, the more the news of that spread. It didn't go up at the moment of the explosion. It went up as the news spread around the globe. And so what you see here is when he plotted that out, that's what the CDP energy did. On the day of, that was July 7th, 2005. So at that point, we had to conclude that there's a form of energy out there that responds directly to consciousness, both individual and collective. And the equipment to set up and test that is ultra simple. So we started testing, okay? Eventually, what we got to was we conducted this really nice test, a very sophisticated test, trying to figure out, again, using a stem, you know, what was this energy? And Lefty suspected that maybe it had something to do with plasma. Plasma is the fourth state of matter. There's solids, liquids, gases, and plasma. The best way to imagine plasma is to, if ever you've seen like a flock of birds, and they're flying, and they swoop, and they dive, and you know, they split, and they come back together. That's how plasma behaves. Plasma is a group of particles that act as one mind. And you can disturb them, but they reorganize. So the first characteristic of a plasma is that it's self-organizing. And one of the things that we had discovered way back in the very beginning was that you could mess with somebody's CDP, but it went right back to what it was. Everything was picked up. Everything was communicated with. But everything returned to its degree of norm, the normal. The second thing was that it was obvious that plasmas were communicating continuously. We brought some water into the lab, hooked it up, watched it for a while. A few days later, brought some other water in, hooked that up, had totally different CDP. Within 24 hours, those two beakers of water were in perfect synchrony with one another. And that happened again and again. The third characteristic of a plasma, these are our definitions, is that it moves as if it is a soliton. Now, a soliton, for those of you who know anything about waves, most waves either have constructive interference, which means they meet and they kind of work well with one another, or they meet and they destroy one another. That's destructive interference. So a soliton is a standing wave. It's a wave that just keeps moving. And if it runs into something, it goes around it and reorganizes itself and keeps on moving. And the last thing is that a plasma funnels energy through itself via vortex action. The central standing wave, have you seen those surfer people who have, they're going down this long wave and it's like they're in a tube? You know, the wave is curling over. Well, that same function is happening, I believe, in the center of the plasma. That wave is turning over, and it's sucking in energy at one end, and it's giving out energy at the other end, and the energy that it's giving out energy at is called the head, and it's actually got a particle on the end of it. When there's enough energy, you get a particle. Otherwise, it just stays a wave. Okay, so that's the characteristics of a plasma. And the charge, at this point, Lefty changed CDP from charge density pulses, because first all he had to go on was, look at that gigantic pulse. And then it would kind of go down, but it would never go out. It would just find a place that it would steadily move. And he said, you know what, when we got done, we published a paper, it was published maybe 2 years ago, that showed our research establishing that CDPs were plasmas. And these are some things to consider. Plasmas are present in all living systems. They are charge carriers, and they have very sophisticated properties that are nothing to do with electronic conduction. The charge density plasma operates as an energy transport system. Remember that when we get down a couple more, let's see how far we have to go here. They operate as energy transport systems similar to the superconductivity mechanisms found in Josephson junctions. And on that note, we have been able to produce superconductivity in the lab at room temperature. So the plasmas have soliton characteristics, which means they are not easily destroyed. And every type of tissue has its own configuration of plasmas, of charge density plasmas. So we got to that point and realized that all of the study of plants and animals and people and stuff and da-da-da, that what we had was this huge pile of evidence that people, plants, animals, and even the planet are a collection of charge density plasmas. So, if plasmas respond to consciousness, what does that tell you about the capacities and the potentials that are inherent in any body, or in the communication between you and any body, be that the body of a geranium or the body of the earth, etc. It's all there to be communicated with. At this point, he had a full theory put together for a crop circle. It was a plasma vortex. And these were the kinds of energies that made up that plasma vortex. Microwaves. The microwaves are what fried the seeds or curled up the growing tip of the stem. They cause the expulsion cavities and the node expansion. Plants are basically plastic. They're cellulose. So when you heat them, you can stretch them. And that's exactly what happened. If the crop circle has a predominance of microwaves in it, the plant's just going to, and it's going to go over in the same direction that the vortex is moving. A vortex is, think of a tornado. It's a whirling tornado composed of these kinds of energy. There are electric fields produced by charge separations in plasma vortices. And I don't want to say too much about that because it gets into a whole science lesson, but I'll show you an example of how that works as we get a little further on. There are ion electron avalanches, and those influence seed chemistry. We learned to reproduce those in the lab, and we have been able to increase the germination and production of seeds. I think we got 70% more carrots, 400% more switchgrass, 70% more tomatoes. Just an amazing increase in what a seed was capable of producing, with resistance to heat and cold, drought and wet, bacteria and virus, and tremendous amount of increase in what a seed is able to produce. And I have some pictures of that, but I couldn't put everything in this thing. So there are magnetic fields produced by the motion of ions and electrons inside the plasma. There's the influence of Earth's electric fields, which varies across the surface of the Earth. There can be anywhere from 1 to 100 ohms, on the surface of the Earth. And that electric field coming out of the Earth interacts with the plasma vortex and may change the shape of it in some way. There's a tremendous amount of stability in the darn thing, moving, whirling at tremendous rates of speed, and there's also a tremendous amount of turbulence. And then there's stacking. Thermal gradients are stacked inside and outside the vortices. And so the result that you get is something like this. You get, you can see the charge separations. You can see, where the various, microwaves, etc. Microwaves cause the plants to lay right down. So here's another one. What we realized was that crop circles are Earth's chakras. So the interaction going on, a plasma vortex is a way of taking in information. And I think, this is just the U.S. From 1880 to 1980, I don't know if you can see those little yellow dots on there. Those are just crop circles reported in the U.S. over the last 100 years. We also have crop circles in ice. Amazing. Like I said, I couldn't put everything in here. But, there's amazing arrangement or assortment of crop circles that appear. You'll see these grass rings sometimes in your yard. I have a crop circle, and I have a vortex, actually, in my backyard on my farm. And that has been very interesting to watch. I got some mushrooms the year before last, probably that big around. They're just huge. Everything gets bigger when it has an opportunity to be exposed to very high energies. So here's a picture of a plasma, okay? So now in this part of the talk, we're getting toward the end here. I just want to show you what a picture of plasma looks like, and then I want to show you a picture of human plasmas. The root chakra and the navel chakra there, those were drawn 75 years ago by Charles Leadbeater. Very, very similar. So what you have is the chakra is actually a large plasma vortex. And I want to, hang on, I think the next one is. So that was his drawing of the system of main chakras. Now when I look at a human being, there's one in the front and there's a matching one in the back. And what you get is a counter-rotating vortex system. And what happens when you get a counter-rotating vortex, which I talk about a little bit in the book, but didn't have enough time to get into that tonight, you get an area where the two come together where there's no charge. This charge is going this way, this charge is going this way, and where they come together, you get an area where it dumps its particles. And you and I are the result of the dumping of that set of chakras, that set of counter-rotating vortices dumping particles into an energy system that builds a human body, or builds a plant, or builds a planet, and then continues to communicate in every direction. So what we have here is a whole different way of seeing the human body, and really some pretty good evidence that chakras are there and they are operational, etc. And this is just a statement that says, what does a plasma vortex do? Which is what a chakra is. It takes in information energy from the ocean of energy around it, and it uses that energy to maintain form and function. Now, there's a whole theory of consciousness that I have developed, but I don't want to go into that tonight because I wanted to present Lefty's work. Dr. Levengood has really done some amazing work, but we live in an ocean of information, and every wave carries information. Every wave is a store of information which it inputs into its particle when it makes a particle, and then reabsorbs and maintains when it goes back to being just a wave. So let's see here. So things to consider. So we have this plasma stuff now. A plasma is a collection of loosely associated particles. You know, remember the bird thing, you know? All these particles working together, whose energies can be raised, whoops, from a ground state of existence and function to a higher state of existence and function. And here's what happens when you do. Here's just hydrogen. And I don't know why people haven't put this together before. Up in the top left corner, you get just an ordinary hydrogen atom in a ground state of energy. If you add energy to that, and you jump that up to a higher state of energy, all of a sudden it becomes 2. You can see that whole column, how it changes as you go from an S state to a D state to a P state and so on. And here you've got an isomer of hydrogen right next to it, which becomes even more complex. That same thing happens to you. Now, I have a photo that I couldn't show because I don't have permission to use that yet. But I'm going to get permission to use it because it's a story of a fellow who was out in the east or west coast, and he was a monk. And he was at some kind of a holistic health fair and wandering around, and somebody was there taking pictures of auras. You know, you've all seen those. You get your aura taken. And the guy who had the camera and was taking the pictures was being a jerk to this woman who was in line ahead of the monk. And I guess the photographer was rude, he was thoughtless, he was, I don't know what all he was doing, but our friend, the monk, was very upset with him. And the more he watched this treatment, the more upset he got. So at some point he realized, this guy is really getting to me. I better get centered. You know, I better put my monk meditation hat on. So he gets very quiet, and he gets very centered, and finally it's his turn to get the picture taken. And the guy is just as rude to him as he was to the woman. And so the guy takes this picture, and it is a phenomenal photograph of somebody who has developed their chakras to an amazing degree. And what you see is this huge gold pool right here, and another one not quite as defined here, and these two red rays coming straight out here. It's just, I have it on my computer, but I can't show it publicly. The photographer, when he saw the picture, went, "Oh, sir, could I have that? Could I?" And the monk said, "No, sorry." You know, he was just so, you know, irritated with the guy. He said, "Nope, I decided I wasn't going to share." So, you know, but the point of the matter is that now, and we're coming to some things that kind of move over into the field of consciousness. I didn't say in the beginning, but back in 1979 and from there forward, I had a full spontaneous awakening of Kundalini, which is a massive change in your life. It's a massive change in your consciousness. It's why I left Chrysler. And, yeah. It was a time that was so awful. I had no background in metaphysical anything, no interest, you know. I was a good little Catholic girl from the country, etc. And I have this massive experience, and overnight, boom, you're psychic, you're in and out of the body, you're clairvoyant, you're clairaudient, you're clairsentient, reading people's minds, able to be in 2 places or 3 places at one time. It's crazy making. If you don't have any background, it's crazy making. And so I struggled. You know, I ended up going back to school to study the brain and consciousness and perception and all of that, trying to figure out what happened to me. And, you know, it finally, I thought I had the answer. It took me 5 years to realize that it was Kundalini. They call this thing that's happening Kundalini. And that gave me, like, something to hang on to. Like, okay, maybe I'm not really crazy. But it wasn't until, and then I had other theories and pieces that I developed along the way, but what I realized as, you know, I was working with Lefty and being tutored in astrophysics and biophysics, etc., was that the people in the science world never even thought, I mean, they don't know about Kundalini, you know? So they never even thought of putting this, you know, gee, there's a change of state happening here. What happens when you get a change of state going in a body is that it has different characteristics, different properties, different abilities, and sometimes even a different form. So what, you know, this is a small example of the kinds of changes that happen just in hydrogen. And if you get a human being who has had a Kundalini experience, or like our friend the monk, who's developed tremendous, you know, abilities of consciousness, you get this amazing development of his chakra system. So taking in information and using that to build itself. So it's a little statement for the conclusions. all things seek to raise their energy state to higher, more efficient, and more powerful levels of function. We are programmed to evolve. And all you need is one exposure to a higher form of energy. If it is a significant enough exposure, as in being exposed to UFOs, your energy, which is highly intelligent, will utilize that information to reorganize itself. And you will never be the same again. And it is the same thing that occurs in a Kundalini event. So what you've got, here's what ancient literature says. Kundalini is the release of an energy that lies coiled up at the base of the spine. When I first had Kundalini, my reaction, was, well, actually 5 years later when I discovered this, was, why don't they say anything about what happens to your poor consciousness? Why don't they say anything about the sexual stuff that goes on in a Kundalini event? Sexual excitation is a preparation for higher states of consciousness. But we waste it, so it's gone. So, I mean, if you're having kids, that's not a waste. I can see where the old adage, don't waste your sexual energy unless you're having kids, comes from. Of course, I didn't listen to that either. But so what we have here is a whole new way of looking at consciousness. It's the result of a spontaneous leap to a more complex level of organization and function. Getting to higher consciousness means you are different energetically, and that will show up on the equipment. And we have been able to fiddle with our energy, Levengood and I. And so I put my hands in this little gadget that we have developed. My energy went up within 20 minutes, 1,400%. We stopped when we ran out of paper on the chart recorder. It was still going up. There are ways to increase consciousness, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of people who play at higher consciousness, and it's nice practice. I wish that I had had the practice before Kundalini, the discipline, the knowledge, the idea that, you could say it differently, or you could act differently, or you could think differently, or you could have different expectations, or whatever. I didn't, and so I really stumbled a lot. I really suffered a lot. And the story of my full awakening is over there in a book called The Evolving Human. But what has become clear now as we've developed this science of consciousness is that the awakening of consciousness is a move to a higher energy state. And once that happens to you, you don't have to do much to maintain it. It's going to do you. It works. Yeah. So, a move to higher consciousness is a leap to a higher energy state that is more efficient at moving energy into and through a living system, whether that's a planet, a human, a plant, or an animal. That's just a kind of a recap of what I said. Thank you for coming. So.